So we're calling this session Rules of the Road for the working press, because we're living in a split-screen world where sometimes it's hard to distinguish the violent images flashing across our screens from war zones or the streets in the U.S. The fatal shootings of 2 U.S. citizens by government agents have only underscored the increasing risks to reporters and photographers whose press badges have been no shield against assault or even worse. And with the prospect of anti-war demonstrations to follow the U.S. strikes in Iran, there's a new urgency for journalists to know the rules of the road before hitting the street. For our own protection, Steve Solomon and Mickey Osterreicher are here to help. Steve is the Marjorie Dean Professor of Journalism at New York University, where he teaches First Amendment law. He is founding editor of First Amendment Watch. I commend that to you for your own research and interest. It covers current conflicts over the freedom of expression. He is author of Revolutionary Dissent, How the Founding Generation Created the Freedom of Speech. And he also has a new book, A Republic of Rights, that's being published by Bloomsbury Press this year. Will describe how the founders protected individual rights in America and built safeguards against, quote, the monster of tyranny. Particularly relevant now and then. Mickey serves as general counsel to the National Press Photographers Association. He is an award-winning visual journalist with more than 50 years of experience in print and broadcast. Doesn't nearly look like 50 years on the street, but there he is. And has been a uniformed reserve deputy sheriff with the Erie County Sheriff's Office since 1976. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, USA Today, as well as ABC World News Tonight, Nightline, Good Morning America, NBC, Nightly News, pretty much everywhere, and ESPN. He's been an advocate for cameras in the courtroom, the federal shield law, media access in general, public photography, and the use of drones for news gathering. So a lot on his plate and a lot to discuss here. So we talked yesterday, and I think probably the best way to go about this is make this as interactive as we possibly can. As we talk about various themes, we'll have our distinguished guests here talk about them, but feel free to jump in with questions, and I'll try to get the questions, interrupt so we can get questions to, your questions answered. As usual, I'll start out with a couple of questions to start the conversation rolling, and then we'll go from there. But feel free to jump in whenever you have a concern, question, because this is for you and for your benefit. Okay? All right. So how about if we start with the basics? Do journalists have any special rights of access apart from the public to cover the news? Steve, I'll start with you.
So in terms of covering protests in the street, the First Amendment gives extraordinary protection for the rights of protest, but there's no special protection for members of the press. Members of the press have rights that are coextensive with those of the protesters themselves. And so, for example, we'll get into more detail later, but just generally, when the police issue an order that affects people in the street, protesters or onlookers, journalists are have the same restrictions themselves, unless they have special permission. Where does special permission come from? It may come from the press pass that you have. If you made arrangements with the police chief or whoever is in command at that on the street, um, uh, special permission to cover this and and you make it clear that you're not a protester yourself, that you're operating in a public interest. And sometimes that can work. I don't think you can assume that just having a press pass gives you rights beyond what's available to protesters and the public generally, unless you have a specific agreement, verbally or otherwise.
The whole idea that we've been getting some traction with, fortunately, in a number of cases, is the fact that we, as journalists, are not participants. We are there to observe. We're providing a specific function. And in a number of cases, the courts have agreed with us, and that when there is an unlawful assembly declared, and that's what police have to do at first to issue a dispersal order, that applies to the protesters. It doesn't necessarily apply to the press. Now, trying to make that argument out on the street to a police officer, if there's no prior understanding, is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. But what you really need to do is make sure you're aware of the unlawful assembly statutes in your state. If you look at those, you'll see that most of the time they'll talk about when three or more people assemble or participate. They'll use those type of adjectives. And again, the courts have said the press is there to serve another function, and that having them disperse actually obviates that function when they're not there to see what the police are then doing out on the street. So we've had, as I said, some success in a couple of cases, and just be aware of those statutes. That doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. It then reverts to what's known as reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and those vary. So an officer may ask you to step back. They're worried about weapon retention. If you're close enough to reach them and reach any one of their weapons or grab a hold of them, they can direct you to step back. Those reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions get much broader if, let's say, there's an active shooter or a bomb scare or something like that. The reasonable time, place, manner restrictions might put you back a couple of blocks away along with the public. But in terms of those orders to disperse, hopefully you'll have somebody will have gotten some clarity ahead of time about, as we're talking about the rules of engagement, the rules of the road here, in terms of what you can and can do.
Just to follow up on that, and this goes to, I would assume, the time, place, and manner restrictions. But when does the press's presence amount to interference in a law enforcement operation? Either one of you, maybe.
De facto, it should never amount to interference, just as the act of photographing and recording police should not by itself be interference. If you are standing in the way of police and they direct you to move back, you need to comply with that. But when they tell you to leave the area and go away, that's something that may go beyond what the scope of their authority is. The problem is that we're going to talk about all these things here and tell you what your rights are. But at the end of the day, a journalist or anyone on the street saying, "I know my rights," is oftentimes the last sentence that they get to utter before hearing, "Turn around, put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest." If they even get that courtesy. And these days, we just see journalists being taken down, slammed against the wall, slammed against a car. It goes from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds. 1 minute you're working, and the next minute you're detained and under arrest. So we can tell you what those rights are, but out on the street, you really need to maintain that situational awareness and be very aware of what's going on around you to try and stay out of harm's way, try and prevent from being injured, prevent from being detained, prevent from being encircled or kettled. There's just so many things to be aware of while you're out there.
Yeah. So the emphasis here is on what's reasonable under the circumstances. So, as Mickey said, it's really highly dependent on what's going on in the street. So, if you have a peaceful demonstration and there's no problem, there's no disturbance associated with this, then you're probably not going to be hassled by the police. But the more difficult the situation becomes, if police are taking action against protesters, they're arresting them or trying to move them with a dispersal order, that's when it becomes more difficult for journalists. And you have to be well aware of what's going on around you. What's reasonable is a question of what's reasonable under the circumstances in terms of the police action.
And I just want to add one other thing. Oftentimes, when there are protests, demonstrations, depending on how widespread they are, we see the executive branch issue a curfew, and pretty much almost every time that happens, there will be exceptions for what's known as essential personnel, and that's usually part of the order. And almost always the media are included as part of that essential personnel. So if you are working and you're aware that there's a curfew, you really need to go to that executive order, take a look at it, maybe even print it out. You will usually see a clause there that the press is defined as essential personnel and are not subject to the curfew. But again, trying to explain that to an officer who is telling you to do or not do something, they're going to win on the street. Whether you win later in court is something else. But as I tell our members and others, no good images can be made while you're handcuffed or zip tied with your hands behind your back in a patrol car or paddy wagon. The whole idea is you're trying to stay out there and be able to do your job.
You mentioned, both of you, I think, the quick escalation of events these days, the 0 to 100 often on the street. Is there a way you could sort of counsel folks here, sort of best practices for trying to slow that process down in a way that you can have either a conversation or at least a meeting of the minds with whoever's in charge?
Steve, do you want to go first or?
Go ahead, Mickey.
Sure. So the time to have that discussion is not out on the street. The time to have that discussion is beforehand. The time to have that discussion is throughout the course of your work experience. Reach out. I mean, I do a lot of training with journalists. I also do a lot of training with police. And I tell the same thing to both parties. The police really need to reach out to the media. The media needs to reach out to the police beforehand, having meetings, getting to know each other, understanding what their challenges are, they understanding what your purposes are, having that dialogue and having an understanding of the rules of the road, the rules of engagement beforehand is really the key to this. Identifying a point of contact, not to call and say how many people were arrested, how many people were injured, but a point of contact being somebody that your newsroom can call if you're taken into custody to find out where you are, what's happening to you, what you're being charged with, those kinds of things. So, you might find an incident commander, you might find a supervisory officer who's willing to listen to you, but when things are going south, and there's all kinds of activities, try to have a discussion about what you can and can't do is usually not very productive.
I think if it's a relatively calm situation, if a reporter happens upon a police officer dealing with some protesters, and there's no violence, there's no immediate possibility of harm. It may be possible to talk with a police officer. I talked with a reporter recently who was recording a demonstration that was going on. The police officer comes up to him and says he needs to stop recording. And he very patiently and in a civil manner told the police officer, I'm standing on a public sidewalk. I'm well back. I'm not interfering with anything that's going on. And the police officer said, have a good day, carry on. So it is possible. But as Mickey says, if there's violence, if there's a lot of difficulty going on, things can happen very quickly, and you won't have a chance to talk with a police officer. So a lot of this, again, is dependent on what is going on around you, and I think your best guide is to make a judgment about that. The more difficult the situation, you're just not going to have an opportunity to reason with a police officer. And then the choice is you either comply or you're going to go to jail. Probably you're going to be arrested, taken into custody. And as Mickey said, better to move away and perhaps continue to report and record with your phone than to end up in the police wagon.
I have one here that's just sort of hanging, and that is that I guess relates to what we're talking about and whether there are rights to privacy in public spaces.
Well, definitionally, we distinguish public from private, where the highest reasonable expectation you have of privacy is in your own home. And the least expectation of privacy you have is out on the street. We're photographed and recorded scores of times a day by dash cams, body cams, surveillance cameras. It's when you go outside, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. And, we see that coming into play. It used to be with police officers saying, you can't record me. I think for the most part, they understand, especially since they have their own body cams, that the same rules apply to them and to us. We can record them, they can record us. We just can't physically interfere with them to do that. So you can't stand in the way of if they're trying to move through and do something, you can't block them, but you can certainly stand there and photograph and record. Where we see it more is where protesters tell you that you can't photograph and record them because they don't want to be photographed and recorded. And the problem is that if they're out on the street, and they're doing whatever they're doing, then they can be photographed and recorded by, as I said, all of these various things. And the counter argument that I made when I've been faced with protesters who say, no, you can't do that is, so imagine you had a protest of 10,000 people. They're out there to actually have their voices heard. Part of that, First Amendment, the other clauses of the right to assemble and the right to petition for grievances. That's what they're doing. And imagine that the media didn't cover that. There was nothing in the newspaper. There was nothing on television. There was nothing reported about this gathering of 10,000 people. Well, it cuts both ways. You can't say, please come out and cover us, but don't photograph and record me. Once again, trying to make that rational argument, that rational discussion with protesters is sometimes pointless. And whereas police can be subject to federal civil rights lawsuits after the fact if they detain you improperly, arrest you improperly, injure you, the same isn't true of protesters. So I worry for journalists more sometimes about the protesters and being injured by them than I do necessarily the police. Although we've seen, a real rash of excessive use of force with less lethal munitions being fired inappropriately and certainly seriously injuring many journalists over the course of these past few years.
On that issue of rights to privacy in public spaces. I think I remember conversation from last October where you have, journalists who are close to or in proximity of police questioning a suspect. And I wonder if, obviously everybody wants to know who the police are interested in an event like that. But do the police have a right to privacy there, or the individual? And how should we respond to whatever they're telling us?
Well, the best way for them to do it, and the way I advise them to do it, is they then need to take the person that they're talking to, whether it's a witness, a victim, whatever, they can move them to a place that's not necessarily a public place. They can put them into a patrol car and sit and talk to them there. They can take them into the station house if there's one nearby. There are um, opportunities for them to create some privacy for themselves, but not to necessarily demand that in a public place because they're really on shaky grounds there. If they set up a perimeter, police line, and nobody can cross that, and they set it up for a reason other than to just keep the press away, and then they're inside that perimeter, they can take them further into the perimeter and have that conversation with them. But if they're out in public, there's basically no reasonable expectation of privacy for the police, for the victims, for the witnesses. And that's just the way it is.
It's quite possible that if the police think you're getting too close, they may ask you to move back. And in moving back, you may no longer hear the conversation that's going on. Um, as far back as you move, if it's 15 feet, 20 feet, it should not terribly affect the visuals that you create because you have a telephoto lens, which you can use and bring everything up close. But of course, it wouldn't necessarily account for the distance in terms of audio. But you do have to obey police orders. So you don't want to stay really, really close and then pay for it with an arrest.
So, just to that point, the National Press Photographers Association, along with a number of other groups, brought a suit against the NYPD for their treatment of the press during the Black Lives Matter protests a number of years ago. And there was a settlement in that lawsuit. And one of the terms of that settlement, as it applied to the press, is that police must allow you to remain close enough to see and hear unaided by any electronic or optical devices what's going on. So we have that, in New York, again, it's one thing to have that settlement
Yeah, yeah,
on the books, and it's another thing to see what happens in real life. But yeah, you should be able to be close enough to see and hear, but oftentimes that doesn't happen.
yeah. These agreements are great. They can help you once an arrest is made, perhaps. But again, be aware that the training of police officers varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and even if they do it well in some jurisdiction, things happen quickly in the streets, and police officers have to make judgments. They won't always make judgments that are correct, but you're faced with perhaps a police order, and you have to make up your mind pretty quickly what to do. I think that, keep in mind that the First Amendment protects the right to make recordings of police officers. The majority of federal appeals courts have ruled that way. And again, it's subject to the time, place, and manner restrictions that we've talked about, we've alluded to from time to time in this discussion. But you do have a First Amendment right if you're standing on streets, sidewalks, and parks, as long as you don't interfere. And the idea of interference goes to the time, place, and manner restrictions. So getting really close and putting the camera in a foot away from the police officer is probably going to lead the police officer to say, "Hey, you're too close. Please move back." So that's what you face. But you do have a First Amendment right. That's not a privilege. You have a right to record. You have a right to be in the streets. covering it until fact-based, based on context, things get perhaps out of control, and the police officers have these time, place, and manner regulations that they can enforce.
Miguel, go ahead and identify yourself for the benefit so they know who you are.
Hi, I'm Miguel Pineda with Scripps News. Thank you guys for taking our questions. The First Amendment is obviously under assault a lot of different ways. You all have touched on that. Do you think that there needs to be further concrete legislation to protect journalists or allow them to do their jobs? I guess put more bluntly, is the First Amendment strong enough 250 years later in today's age?
Well, as Steve said, it's not just the First Amendment. What happens normally, and we're going to just briefly go through what happens when police don't respect that First Amendment right. So, if you get sued, if the police get sued, it's under 42 United States Code Section 1983, and practitioners just call them 1983 actions, not for the year, but for the section of the statute. And once you bring that lawsuit, the police will assert what's known as qualified immunity. And the only way you get to overcome that is if you can show two things. One, that there was a constitutional right violated, a First Amendment, a Fourth Amendment right, usually 14th Amendment, sometimes a combination of all of those. And then the second thing is that right was clearly established, and clearly established is a legal term of art. That means that any reasonable police officer should know that they were violating that right. And as Stephen said, this has been litigated in federal court. The Supreme Court twice has refused to grant cert on the question. They have never opined on it. But a number of circuits have. And for a while, it was all the odd numbered circuits, the first, third, fifth, seventh, ninth, and 11th. We've added two more, the fourth and the 10th. So there's only a few left, unless the Supreme Court eventually weighs in and reverses things. That right to photograph and record, on top of the First Amendment right, is clearly established by a legal precedent. So it is being enforced. But again, as we keep saying, it's one thing to have those rights, to have a First Amendment, to have statutes that protect journalists, but out on the street, you really need to be aware that somebody may violate all of those rights, and you want to keep working and reporting. So you got to find that balance of your own safety.
Yeah. In terms of the adequacy of the First Amendment and the power of the First Amendment to protect this kind of reporting, the cases that have gone, a number of the cases that have gone into federal appeals court on recording and the First Amendment right to record, there's been a challenge to the idea that, yes, the dissemination of information is protected by the First Amendment, but the assertions have been made that the actual recording action itself is not. And the courts have been unanimous in saying that the collection of news in this way, the use of cameras, the use of your pen and paper is protected just as much as a dissemination. One goes with the other. If it wasn't protected, then it'd be like the police coming into your newsroom and taking your computer away. The production of the information, the recording of the information is protected, as is its publication and dissemination. So that's the way that the First Amendment has been used to protect the press. And I think so it's from the beginning of the process to the end, again, subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, which we come back to over and over again because it's just so fact dependent on what's happening in the streets.
And just to add to that, we keep talking about the First Amendment. Obviously, there are a lot of clauses there. I talked about two of them. The two that we're really talking about here today is the freedom of the press clause, but it's more the free speech clause that really weighs in on this. And And the reason for that is, and I talk about this all the time, is oftentimes the police look at the act of recording as behavior. The courts look at the act of photographing and recording so that you can disseminate this information to the public as an expressive activity. And while freedom of speech sounds like the written word, the spoken word, it also, through again case law, applies to photography and videography. Those are forms of expressive activities, not behaviors, and that's how the courts distinguish and provide that protection to the kinds of things that we do, in addition to the free press clause.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Scores with CNN. I'm just curious, I used to cover protests in Portland, and one of the best practices that they gave us was writing like our managing editor's phone number on our arms. And what are things you've encountered of, when we go out into these situations, what have you heard journalists do in order to protect themselves and that sort of thing?
Well, the advice you got was correct because unfortunately, most of us don't know phone numbers anymore. We just rely on our phones to either hit one or call mom or do whatever, and you're not going to have your phone if you're taken into custody. So writing an indelible marker on your arm, the important phone numbers, absolutely. The other things you really, I mean, there's so many things to be aware of. As I said, the paramount one is situational awareness. Don't be looking down at the back of your camera to see what you took pictures of. Really pay attention to what's going on around you. Make sure if you do have your phone, that all of the biometrics are turned off, that you don't have it open. Make sure it's password protected and make sure that you can't open it with your face or a thumbprint because the police may just take your phone and hold it up, and if it's on and it opens up, they'll go through it. Whether they have a right to or not is another question. The whole idea is you don't want them to do that. If it's password protected, you can refuse to give them the password. Now, they may threaten you and say, hey, we're going to arrest you if you don't let us look at your phone. I would say at that point, anytime you're given the choice of being arrested or not arrested, it's a personal one. We can tell you all the things in the whole world. Your editors can tell you stuff, but again, it's very personal to be arrested and taken into custody. So you need to make that decision. But I would, strongly caution you to not allow them to look at your devices and to set them up in ways that they cannot do it. I think Stephen the other day, and I'll let him talk about this, is thinking about, maybe getting a burner phone or something that doesn't have all that information that we carry in our phones.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to go out and cover a protest and be at risk of arrest or being detained, then seriously consider getting a really cheap disposable phone and leaving your normal phone at home. If the police confiscate your phone, you're going to be without it. And think about what's on the phone, or your sources, or your messaging, or your personal information. So if you know you're going out to cover a protest, have another phone in reserve, and then you won't risk that. But I think that's you don't want to lose your phone. And as Mickey said, the police, in order to search your phone, have to have a search warrant specifically. That comes from a Supreme Court case of 2014. But there's ways that they can, or at least try to get around it. As he said, if it's easy to get your phone to open up because of the biometrics, you may look at your phone, the phone opens up, and they take it from you to look at because they say, well, we want to open up the case to make sure there's no razor blade in there or something, and then the phone is open. So they may make the assertion that you gave your consent to a search by the fact that the phone opened up when in fact you may not have had any such intention. So you have to be really, really careful, protect yourself, think about this in advance when you go into a situation like this.
Some other things are always keep recording, even if you're not getting good video. You want to have at least audio of any encounters with police because it's going to be a he said, she said, and there's a presumption that police are telling the truth. If you're arrested and this happens to go to trial and we don't get it dismissed ahead of time, and there's nothing better than having a recording of you acting calmly, being quiet, being respectful. If, in a situation where somebody comes up and says to you, you can't record or you need to stop recording, you continue to record, you record yourself trying to explain in a rational manner why it is that you're entitled to do that, being in a public forum, the traditional street and sidewalk. And what you want to do is show the police just being out of control and acting inappropriately. That's going to save you in the end. Working in pairs, so that somebody's there always watching your back. If you don't have the luxury of being able to have more than one person cover these events, certainly let your editors know where you are. Try and set up check-in times. There's just so many things that you really should be aware of. And most importantly, and I'm hearing Scripps and I'm hearing CNN, my understanding is that your newsrooms are providing much of this advice, or they should be. And if you've got questions, you really need to abide by what your employers want you to be doing in these situations, at least giving you those general guidelines so you have a better understanding of it. We can give you some general ones, but I'm pretty sure agencies such as those big ones have guidelines and should be giving you training in advance before sending you out there out on the street.
I'll add that if you're approached by a police officer who says, "Give me your phone. I want to see what you've recorded," don't give them your phone. Again, there's a requirement of search warrant. But you have to keep your wits about you. You have to understand that the police officer has no right to open up your phone without a search warrant. But if you consent to a search, then that's on you. So you want to be prepared. These things can come up very quickly, be under immense pressure. But being prepared means understanding in advance, I am not going to open up my phone voluntarily to a police officer. And you just refuse to do that. You say what your rights are.
Hi, I'm Alex with Alabama Daily News, and I've been in more local newsrooms experiences where we don't have as big of corporations with such strict rules on how to approach these situations. And I was wondering if you had any advice in terms of having conversations with your editors in your newsrooms about these certain situations, or maybe after the fact, because I've been in situations before where, there's been threat of arrest, and maybe I decided in that moment I'm going to move back, but then my editor be mad that, I should have stood my ground more. How do you recommend having those conversations when, you're the one out there in the field dealing with the police, but your editors might not be happy with your decision about maybe pulling back?
It's really important to have both conversations beforehand. So you understand what their expectations are. They understand what your realities are. It's one thing to be an editor. Hopefully, most of the editors have been out on the street and understand themselves what it's like to be out on the street. But my understanding is there are some people that have risen in ranks and become editors and have never been out on the street. So at the bottom, the end of this is no matter how much they're going and willing to protect you legally, back you up legally, at the end of the day, if you get arrested, you're still the one that's taken into custody, being held against your will for however long, being put in places that you may not feel comfortable in. I mean, during the protests, during COVID, we heard of many situations where people were arrested and then where everybody was wearing masks and trying to have social distancing were crammed into cells, rooms, buses, areas where nobody had a mask, and were put in situations where, when COVID was rampant, that was a threat to their health and safety. So I think ultimately it's your decision. It should be your decision to make. Editors, I can't imagine an editor who would not be respectful enough to understand that. And if you really feel like you're in a position of they're going to expect me to do things that I'm not comfortable doing, then you might have to make the decision to say, yeah, maybe you need to get somebody else to cover this out on the street if you're not going to back me up. And I know these are really difficult conversations to have, but they certainly need to be had. And then afterwards, you really need to debrief. You need to talk about, okay, this is what we thought was going to happen. This is what actually happened. What do we do so the next time we can do better?
I would also suggest that you have a conversation that includes what happens if you are arrested in terms of legal counsel. Perhaps you're working for a news organization that has legal counsel on staff or access to them immediately. But some of you may be working for a news organization that doesn't, and you need to have, I think, in advance a plan for an immediate contact with legal counsel to make sure that you're taken care of as soon as possible. You don't want to be arrested and then try to figure out, oh, who am I going to call and who would it be, what organization, what's the phone number. I think that's something that is wisely set up in advance. There are organizations that provide free legal counsel. You can call, for example, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press maintains, I think, a 24-hour line. Maybe Mickey's organization does that as well. How's that, Mickey?
Yeah, so we have a network. We work with the Reporters Committee all the time. Lawyers for Reporters is another group. But yeah, you just need to have that point of contact. If one of our members get arrested, obviously we can't be in all 50 states. So I've been contacted, in the middle of the night. I used to kiddingly say I was a mom's best friend because when you're given, at least for young journalists, when you're given a chance to make one phone call, who are you going to call? You're going to call your mother because she's going to answer when you call. And I've gotten many calls in the middle of the night from a woman who would say, "Hi, you don't know me, but I'm so-and-so's mother, and she was just arrested or he was just arrested, and I'll get the information and then we'll figure out whether it's one of the attorneys from the Reporters Committee or other local attorneys that had volunteered to be available and help represent you." And I've been in many situations across the country where I've done training with police. I was in Ferguson, in Chicago, lots of places where, if somebody got arrested, I would then work with local counsel since I'm not licensed to practice law in every state and get those people out and deal with that. But again, working with your editors, having these conversations beforehand is just critical, whether you're an employee or you're a freelancer. If somebody's hiring you, a news organization is hiring you, it's a good idea to get an understanding from them as to, hey, if I get arrested, am I on my own or are you going to represent me?
I think it'd be a good idea to have some written protocols. I mean, if you have an agreement with one editor, it may be that that editor is not available at the time that you need them. Who are you going to talk to then? What are the processes and procedures that are going to help you? Getting this on paper in an accessible way for whatever editor is on duty when you have a problem is, I think, essential here. You don't want to work something out, go to the extent of working something out and understanding with one editor, and then that editor is not available, or maybe they have just left to go on another job. If you can get these protocols down on paper and who's going to be called and so forth, I think that's very much to your benefit.
I wanted to follow up real quickly. Steve, you mentioned the idea of refusing to turn over a phone if a law enforcement officer requests it. And I was curious, obviously, on the streets of the Democratic or Republican national conventions, that was often a pretty pretty common request because at these convention sites, the local police were supplemented by other local police departments from around the region or nearby states, and they weren't operating under, they often were unaware of the rules or were not as, educated perhaps as perhaps some of the law enforcement officers who were assigned to those cities. And I wonder if you decide to surrender your phone or your notes or whatever equipment they're asking for, is that tantamount to capitulation? Is that giving them your consent to review that material or to search it?
Okay, well, let's distinguish a couple of different situations. If you are actually arrested, they're going to confiscate your phone, and you have no choice. They're going to take it. My reference to that was if a police officer comes up to you and says, I see you're recording. What are you recording? Let me take a look. You don't have any obligation to show your phone to a police officer or open it up. And in fact, you should not. If you're arrested, they're going to take your phone. They may also have there's searches that they can do under another Supreme Court case where they want to make sure that those in a certain area are not armed. And so they might be able to do a search and at least look at your phone without opening it, just to make sure there's no weapon hidden like behind a cover or something. But they don't have, even if you're arrested and they take your phone, they have no right to open your phone or make you open the phone. They need a search warrant for that. So hopefully that clears it up a little bit.
And just to go a little bit further, so this is kind of like a bifurcated situation. It's one thing to seize your phone. It's another thing to search your phone. So if there are exigent circumstances, and that's a term used that are circumstances where the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure can be mitigated. And what an officer has to do in those circumstances are, one, they have to have probable cause that a serious crime was committed, and serious by rape, arson, murder, assault, not trespassing, jaywalking, those kinds of things. So probable cause. Then they have to have a good faith belief, which is a lesser legal standard, that there is evidence of that serious crime on the device that you have. And then the third prong, and all three prongs need to be met, is that absent the seizure, that evidence will be lost or destroyed. Our argument has always been that they will never be able to meet that third prong with a journalist. So they can seize your phone, but then they can't look at it until either they get a search warrant, or in the case of a journalist, they need to go get a subpoena because of what's known as the Privacy Protection Act of 1980, which protects a journalist's work product. So, we've seen, as in the Washington Post recently, where the police decided that they wanted information from a Washington Post reporter. And they went to the magistrate to get the warrant signed. They did, in this case, tell in the warrant application that this was a journalist. But what they failed to say, even though to me, somebody that's weighing in on these kinds of things and signing warrants should understand that, they failed to tell the magistrate, inform the magistrate of the Privacy Protection Act of 1980, which at that point, one would think a judge would not have signed the search warrant. In this case, I think a lot of what's going to happen with this case is going to hinge on the fact that they failed to do that. The judge has already indicated that he was not too pleased with the government for leaving that fact out. But, back to what we said, it's one thing to seize a phone to preserve evidence. That's the whole idea of it. It's another thing to kind of turn that idea on its head, where oftentimes police want to get into the phone to possibly delete what you just recorded them doing.
Yeah. And I'll say again, if they're going to seize a phone, better that it be a disposable phone that doesn't have all your information and sources on it and your personal information. So that might be a good investment.
And
Hi, my name's Natalie. I'm a reporter at a trade publication called NextGov. I was wondering if you guys could lay out, honestly, just the basics of if you're in a situation with police or other officials asking for a phone, like what are the rules or laws that you should be pointing to? I know you've already said some of this, but it'd be nice to hear.
Do not turn it over voluntarily. I totally agree with Stephen, but you need to realize that if you don't comply with them, there's a good chance you're going to get arrested. What they're going to charge you with, they're probably going to sit there, as I've seen so many times, and go through the penal code. Oh, what are we going to charge this person with? We just arrested them. Sometimes you're taken into custody, see this all the time, held for a couple of hours, and then all of a sudden you're free to go. I call it catch and release. I wish the release was sooner. Sometimes the release is hours later and they've taken you off the street. They've accomplished what they wanted to do, which is to not have you there to report, photograph, record. But sometimes you're taken into custody and released without charges. Again, it's that whole thing of situational awareness. If you see them making a lot of arrests around you, if you can distance yourself, put some space between you and the people being arrested, close enough again to see and record. But even if you miss, one arrest and then are able to continue, move around, move to another area, and continue your journalist activities, that's much better than getting taken into custody along with everybody else.
the first part of your response we missed because we had a freeze up in the line. So I would imagine that from listening to the recent response is by, in no case, give up your phone without a warrant. Is that a good way to approach it?
Yeah, I mean, again, the warrant to seize it could be different than the warrant to search it. If they've got the exigent circumstances, which, as I said, they're not going to be able to satisfy that third prong with a journalist because their reason for being out there is to gather and disseminate information. I can't imagine any good journalist intentionally deleting any of what they recorded. And they need to preserve that. So it's one thing for them to seize your equipment, as we saw in the Washington Post. It's another thing for them to be able to search it. They're pretty much two different standards here. But
Yeah.
we can keep saying it, and hopefully you'll hear us. It's a very personal thing. We can give you all the advice in the world. You can be 100% dead to rights legally about what you want to do or what you're telling them. No, you can't have my phone. But you also need to understand that may trigger your arrest, whether that's retaliatory or whatever it is. You're the one that has to make that decision as to whether you want to be taken into custody and go to jail that day. And sometimes, as I've seen far too often, you're not even given that decision. 1 minute you're working, you're shooting pictures of something that's newsworthy, and the next minute you're being tackled and handcuffed or zip tied. And nobody asked you for anything. Nobody told you to move back. Nobody said a word, but you're being taken into custody by a police officer. And we've seen it far more with the federal agents now, with ICE and Department of Homeland Security, than we have with regular law enforcement. And unfortunately, aside from the fact that far too many of them think they're above the law, legally, the things that you can do to challenge their authority afterwards, I talked about that 1983 action, do not necessarily apply to federal officers, and they know that. So, whereas an officer might think twice about doing something that violates your constitutional rights, because they, at some point in the future, may end up in court, the federal officers don't necessarily have that same worry.
I think it depends in part on the situation. I think we're talking a lot about situations in which the police officers act quickly. It's a situation where you don't have a whole lot of time to talk to them. But there are some situations where perhaps they try to move you as a reporter out of an area, and maybe you have an opportunity to say, officer, I'm standing on the public sidewalk. I'm not interfering. I'm standing far back. I think I have First Amendment right. You can say that in 15 seconds politely. They may still say, get out of here, and you really need to comply. But it's really going to depend on the situation, how much you can say. You may not be able to say anything at all because it's just such a volatile and quick situation. But you can say in certain situations, and you should think about this in advance, what am I going to do? What am I going to do when I'm confronted with a police officer in different situations? Obviously, there's no situation in which you're going to be able to stand there for 15 minutes and make arguments that your lawyer would make in court. But you may be able to say something on your behalf about your First Amendment rights, about the Fourth Amendment protecting your phone, things like that. Something that you can say in 15 seconds that may make a police officer say, oh, maybe I shouldn't do something.
The one thing that's really important for you all to remember is if you are being taken into custody, that you need to state very clearly, I am a journalist. You need to say it as many times as you can, calmly, not shouting it, not screaming it, but so that other people can hear you. Hopefully, other journalists around that may know you, if you're working in pairs or a pack, should be saying the same thing. Because the last thing we want to have happen is them to go, I didn't know they were a journalist. That's the excuse. The dog ate my homework. It needs to be made very clear on recordings, on witnesses that you stated clearly you were a journalist, that you're covering these things. But, as Stephen said, you may not have time for a long conversation, but saying, I am a journalist, if you have credentials, and you either displaying them, saying, here's my credentials, oftentimes, and I talked about this a little bit, because of a worry about being attacked by the protesters being a journalist, you may have your credentials tucked inside of your jacket or some other way, but have them accessible. And again, if you're approached by a police officer, and you need to think about this too. Let's say if it's inside a jacket pocket, um, and you want to reach for it to show them your credential, explain to them, I'm reaching for my press credential, rather than reaching inside, like almost if you can, pull back the jacket to show that there's nothing there and that your hand is clear. You don't want them thinking you're reaching for a weapon. But again, displaying it, how you display it, in terms of people putting it on lanyards, you need to be careful that those are breakaway so somebody can't strangle you or yank you by the neck by that, because it's not going to break. That's the last thing you want to have happen, is to be injured in that way. There's just so many different things, that we can talk about here, but until you've been out there, until you've been experiencing those kinds of things, they're going to come to you more as second nature, whereas we're just talking about them theoretically here. But for those of you who've been out on the street, I think you know what I'm talking about.
Hi, I'm Yash with Bloomberg. You mentioned before that federal agents can generally get out of 1983. So, what recourse do journalists or anyone have when they are detaining you? Because you said that there are exceptions.
So, there's one case. It's a Bivens case, and that's the name of one of the parties. And rather than bringing a First Amendment claim against the federal officers, it's more of a Fourth Amendment, either use of excessive force or some type of unreasonable search and seizure violation. But it needs to really be tailored almost to the same fact pattern of that case in order for it to succeed. It's just very challenging. There's what's known as a Manel claim. Again, one of the parties in that case, and that's bringing a case against the department itself. Again, much more challenging than against an individual officer. But unless Stephen wants to talk more about it, it's really trying to get very deep into the weeds legally. And, we're all working on trying to figure out how to make federal officers more accountable for their actions. We've never seen federal officers here acting at the scale and the broad scope that they're exercising. I mean, just talking about ICE, who are there for customs and immigration enforcement, and we see them trying to enforce other laws. It's why you see them trying to work oftentimes in tandem with the police, who have the police powers to enforce those state laws, where really the scope of the authority of the ICE officers does not go far enough, yet they're exercising it. So, they're stopping cars, they're doing things like that. Stopping a car if you believe that there's somebody in it that you want for that customs and enforcement and immigration enforcement, that's one thing. But stopping a car for a vehicle and traffic violation is really beyond that scope. But we see them doing it anyway. So, yeah, again, we're telling you what the law is. We're telling you what authority they may or may not have. But out on the street, they're going to do whatever they want, and we've been seeing them do that.
I think, as Mickey said, it's very difficult to get compensated for a violation of your rights, but nonetheless, I think it's worthwhile to make the complaint. Um, there have been journalists who have gotten settlements because of violations of their rights. I'm recalling a journalist maybe 5 years ago in Denver who was arrested on the street for making a recording. And
Susan Green.
exactly, and there's actually videos of that. Um, and she complained to the Denver police department, and she got a pretty quick settlement because they realized that they had done something egregiously wrong. But also in complaining, I mean, that's important too, because you want to ultimately, this may not help you because you've already had this confrontation with the police, but going forward, you want to bring a little bit of pressure on the police department to train their officers better. And that has occurred in situations. I mean, Mickey, you actually do training, so
Well,
a
it's
first
funny that you
responder.
said it's funny that you picked that case because part of Susan's settlement was that the Denver police needed to receive
Yeah,
First Amendment training, and I'm the one who did it. So,
yeah,
but again, it's all after the fact. We're trying to get you to be able to stay out there and safely photograph, record, report on these things without having to resort to having to go
yeah.
to court afterwards.
Hi there, my name is Nina Heller. I'm with CQ Roll Call. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for how to get your newsroom leadership and editors and their various corporate overlords to kind of guarantee that you will have legal protection, because we're having a little bit of an issue with them not fully wanting to put a policy in place guaranteeing us will give you guys will defend you if you get arrested for doing your jobs or whatever. They just want to us to trust that they'll do it, and we want a written policy. So how do you make the case, in addition to all of the very pressing and current examples going on, of why they need to have a written policy for you being able to have defense if you get arrested for doing your work?
I mean, if they're asking you to go in harm's way, then they should be willing to protect you. And whether you're in a place where there's a collective bargaining unit, that should be part of those written agreements. But just like they have agreements on, how many days off you get, how much vacation you get, how much you get paid, it would be nice, especially given the fact that we've seen so many journalists arrested and injured doing these things that you shouldn't necessarily be asking, they should be offering. I'm certainly willing to talk to any folks, I know most of the lawyers for most of the major news organizations, and in my conversations with them, it's a given. I mean, if they're asking you to go in harm's way, that they're the ones that are going to be backing you up. It's maybe a little less so when you're a freelancer and you want to get that clarification from them before you agree to take the assignment. But usually for employees, I can't imagine any worthwhile news organization sending you out there. And then when you call and say, okay, I've been arrested, they go, well, you're on your own. If somebody is acting in a way that's consistent with a journalist of standing there quietly, taking pictures, taking notes, holding a microphone, those kinds of things, that's what a journalist does. If you see somebody that's got press literally in neon flashing lights on their helmet, on their ballistic vest, and then they pick up a trash can and throw it through a plate glass window, that's not consistent with what a journalist does, and they can take enforcement action. You don't get to just say, I'm a journalist and do whatever you want. But the flip side of that is if you're out there doing the news gathering on behalf of a news organization, that they should be protecting you.
Yeah, we have ethical codes that we work under. We have legal codes we work under in the newsroom. And I think the protection of journalists is every bit as important as those things as well. And having an understanding of that, how it applies to you and everybody else in the newsroom, is critically important. And if it's a small newsroom that has trouble, paying for an in-house counsel or any counsel to represent their reporters who get into trouble, again, there are networks of pro bono representation that can help you. But you have to have protocols to set this up in advance, as we said before. Don't rely on things happening to your benefit once the bad situation comes up. The planning, the protocols, the understanding of what lawyer is going to be called, whether it's a lawyer for a news organization or a pro bono attorney. These are protocols that need to be worked out in advance, and protects you, and it protects the newsroom as well. Ultimately, the newsroom does have some financial responsibility for what the reporters do, and so having these protocols is to everybody's benefit.
We've had some unstable connections with you all during this last response, but I think you were saying that her news organization is just negotiating their first contract, a union contract, with the news organization CQ Roll Call. And I wonder if, Mick, do you have any connections with CQ Roll Call that you can make them? But I wonder, not to ask you, what approach would be good for, news or reporters trying to get that benefit, but I wonder how they might proceed.
Well, I think, they don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are lots of news organizations that have been around for a long time that have unions, that have collective bargaining agreements, that have protocols for training, we haven't even gotten into protective gear in terms of, hey, if they're going to send you out there, are they going to give you any protective gear, or are you on your own? Those are things that are important, and having the right protective gear and having training about that. We've been doing that at NPPA for quite a while now. It's one thing to have it; it's another thing to know how to use it. Carrying a gas mask in its canister in its case on your hip, if you don't know how to put it on quickly and so that you get a good seal, especially for women that have a lot of hair or men that have facial hair, you can't just carry it around and expect that, okay, they're going to deploy gas and you're going to be able to put it on. We've seen people that go and get swim goggles as eye protection. Unfortunately, that's going to cause a whole lot more damage if you get hit around the eye than if you had nothing, because it's going to shatter and parts of it are going to be in your eye. We've even seen, the standards that are set for this protective gear. The gear is put through all kinds of testing, and then they set standards as to what kind of protection and what level of protection you have. And they just raise that level because the less lethal munitions now have increased velocity and speeds, and the impact that they create is greater than it used to be. So they just raised those standards for eye protection about a month ago. And so people need to be aware of all of those kinds of things. And again, have conversations, either, hopefully they can be written and incorporated into whatever writings and agreements you have. Stephen was correct. The last thing you want to do is have these verbal agreements with an editor who's either no longer there or not there that day, or who doesn't remember that they agreed to that or said that. That's why contracts are in writing, so that it doesn't become a dispute about, ambiguous terms. So there's just, again, so many things to cover, but at least for me, the bottom line is, if a news organization is going to ask you to go in harm's way, that then they should be willing to back you up by giving you the training, by giving you the gear, and by giving you the legal representation that you might need.
Yeah. Mickey, I'm wondering, since we're running out of time a bit here, we've been talking a lot about what happens on the streets, sidewalks, and parks, but sometimes demonstrations end up going on the private property, which complicates things, right? So, once a protest goes on the private property and you follow them, you can be arrested for trespass. You can be sued for trespass. The streets, sidewalks, and parks, as so says the Supreme Court, are open to protest, subject to the limitations we're talking about. But that doesn't apply to private property, which is in the hands of property owners or the occupiers of the property. And there have been a number of cases over the years where journalists have accompanied protesters on the private property and been arrested or sued otherwise for trespass. And so I think it's useful to make the distinction here between public property and private property, where the owners or occupiers of the property have kind of the last say.
Yeah, and sometimes, trying to figure out what that is, whether, a mall might seem like it's open to the public and it's semi-private or quasi-private. All the journalists that went into the Capitol building on January 6th, I can't tell you the number that I represented, that one of them called me to say he needed help. Because he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He had video of this federal officer being assaulted. The FBI thought that he was one of the insurrectionists, until I was able to intervene, show them his NYPD press card. And at that point, then they wanted the video, which we again said, hey, it's up, it's online. There's everything that he shot is there. Otherwise, in certain cases, we ask that they get a subpoena for those things, as again, not turning them over voluntarily. We don't want to set a precedent for doing that. There's all kinds of intricacies here, but Stephen's absolutely right. Just because you're a journalist doesn't necessarily mean that you can go onto private property without the permission of the owner. And we've seen cases, forget about, protests, but there's a large fire, and your vantage point that you want to get to is on private property. And you find out who the property owner is, a homeowner. They let you into their house so you can look out their window. And we've seen cases where the police want to clear the journalists out, and they'll, tell you need to get out of that house. Hey, I'm here with the permission of the owner. But there's the thing to be aware of is that just because you're a journalist, just because you have First Amendment protections, doesn't mean that you're not subject to generally applicable laws.
Mhm.
I mean, it sounds like the response is going to be much of the same in the moment. Like, the law enforcement officers just can frankly do what they want. But the reference to fires reminded me, so I was in Maui for the wildfires back in 2023. And journalists, like one of the large problems that we had was we were unable to get into Lahaina because it was just completely blocked off from all press, including, because there was obviously the area that was like decimated, and understandably that's like a toxic hazard, so we can't enter that area. But there was, some of the area that had been evacuated, but that no longer posed any sort of active threat. And a lot of us wanted access to get into that area in order to, one, just like see visually the damage, as well as photographers, video journalists, obviously. And I mean, there was like a lot of contention between law enforcement standing there saying, sorry, like none of you can get through, we know you're not the press, or we know you're the press, but none of you can get through. All of us were like, well, we need to report on this. So I guess, I mean, in a moment like that where it's not necessarily something as actively, it's not an urgent situation as a protest. I mean, I guess I continue to wonder in that situation, like, is there anything that I could have said to like justify, I'm with the media, I need to go into this area to do my job.
So, fortunately, and I'll give you this example, California has a statute in their penal code. It's 4095. It's been there for quite a while, and it basically is an assumption of the risk. So for forest fires, for earthquakes, for these kind of natural disasters, where the press had been kept out, there is now an exception when the police set up these perimeters around areas that the press is entitled to go in. If it's during the fire, there's an assumption of the risk. You can go in, but we're not going to expend any resources to come save you if something bad happens. You want to go past our lines? We're required by law to allow you to do that, but we just don't have the resources to do that. The problem is, after some of these fires, and you're talking about aftermath, we've seen a lot of people, unfortunately, not a lot, several people have posed as journalists to get in, and then they've looted homes that have been in there. So, that was another thing we had to deal with in California, where the police are saying, hey, we're letting people in because they're saying they're journalists, and then we find out later that they were in looting these areas. It's just very difficult because, people are becoming savvy that sometimes the press has certain advantages over the regular public. But again, it's just trying to work with police to get them to understand, as you said, trying to argue with them at that police perimeter where they're keeping you out of the area is not the time for the argument. The time is going to be with the chief, with possibly the attorneys for the county or the city or whoever jurisdiction it's in, to say, hey, look, what is going to be the rules of engagement, the rules of the road here? Obviously, this is something that's gone on for a while. So the first day you're out there, they're not letting you in. You go back to your editor to say, hey, I can't get in to report. Can you contact the police chief? Let's have a meeting. Let's find out whether a PIO, a public information officer, will escort us in. I mean, there's creative ways of doing things, but trying to stand there in that moment, trying to convince them to let you through. And then it's going to be, well, if I let you in, I'm going to have to let everybody else in. You're not going to win that argument. But having these conversations so there's a better understanding of what everybody's doing and what they can do and what they can't do beforehand, and be flexible to, things change, facts change, situations change, to be able to deal with those things, think outside of the box. That's what you really need to do.
Mickey, we're in the age of drones. Is that a possibility?
Well, I'm chuckling because, I've been dealing with that. To me, the next natural progression of the right to photograph and record in public
exactly.
is the use of drones. I've been arguing that since 2016. when Part 107 first came into play. Um, just as an example, in Chicago, during the ICE enforcement actions there, the FAA issued a TFR, a temporary flight restriction over, it was unprecedented, 912 square miles, basically covered all of Chicago, where you couldn't fly above 400 feet. Below 400 feet, excuse me. Well, 400 feet is the altitude above ground that a drone is allowed to operate at. It can't go higher than that. We just saw a notice to airmen, a NOTAM that went out that basically sets this moving bubble around all these federal agents, and that you can't operate or fly not only a drone, but any uncrewed aircraft up to 1,000 feet vertically. So that goes higher than a drone can go into areas that a news helicopter might fly, or fixed wing aircraft, and 1,000 feet laterally. And we've been arguing about that, in that it's overly broad. It doesn't satisfy anything. And especially since what we've seen is that these federal officers are renting cars, changing license plates, they're unmarked, trying to identify that you're actually using a drone over one of these places inside those areas that you can't be in, and they move, is almost an impossibility. So yeah, the use of drones is really, the best way to do things. They're far more economical and far safer than flying a helicopter or an airplane.
So in normal news gathering, that might actually be an option, right?
Absolutely, and it
Yeah.
often is
So,
an option,
yeah.
especially, as you said, people looking at aftermath. What happens when there's a disaster? Whether it's a flood, an earthquake, a forest fire, the governor, the president, whoever takes to the air, because you can't understand the devastation until you see it from
Yeah.
that bird's eye view. Standing on the ground, you're going to see whatever is, in direct line of sight, and it doesn't give you the totality, the expanse of all the things you're trying to cover. So absolutely, being able to use drones is critical now for newsrooms that certainly can't afford fixed or rotary wing aircraft.
Yeah. So that might be another thing to take up with your editors, in terms of news coverage in the future, to be able to get drones going and get photographs of places where you can't get to.
Oh, I'm sorry, James, go ahead.
Hi, James Downs at National Journal. Switching gears a little bit, I just wanted to get your guys' assessment on the charges brought against Don Lemon, what was it, last month, 2 months ago? I think it's conspiracy to violate civil rights or whatever it might be. I was wondering what you guys think of how that has played out and how it will play out.
I've commented on it already. I mean, he said he was there as a journalist. If you look at the video, he interviewed the pastor. The pastor could have said immediately, "I need you to leave. You're not welcome in our church." At that point, he would have been on notice, whether he was a journalist or not, that he was wanted to leave. Instead, the pastor had a pretty long interview with him. At some point, he finally said, "You need to leave." Now, whether uh, Don left at that point, I mean, the video stopped. I believe he did. The point is that neither journalist that was arrested in that church was arrested on scene. They were both arrested far, far away days later. And if I recall, what happened is the police couldn't even get the prosecutors to file charges against them. They had to go to a grand jury. And, there's a famous quote that any good lawyer could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, depending on the evidence that they present. So I have a feeling that, the government continues to double down on these things, but I think at the end of the day, they're going to lose.
Yeah, again, what complicates this a little bit is it took place in a church, private property. If the same thing had happened on the sidewalk out in front or on the street, no problem, probably. But inside the church, it's private property. But as Mickey pointed out, the pastor engaged voluntarily in the discussion with him, one could say that that's implied consent, at least until he said, time to leave.
He also said during that interview, this was a public service. The service was open to the public. So then trying to claim, well, it's a lot of these things are very, 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 very fact pattern driven, and you change one fact and it alters the outcome. So, there's all kinds of things to explore here. I think at the end of the day, the journalists will prevail, but this goes back to that whole thing of it's personal. In the meantime, Don was arrested, I think going in to cover the Oscars, the Emmys, one of those award ceremonies, never got to do it. He was taken into custody. Obviously, eventually he was released, even though he offered to turn himself in. His lawyer had him turn. No, they wanted to make a big deal about it. So it's still that personal thing. At the end of the day, it's really you that this is happening to and nobody else. So you have to look inside of yourself and say, do I want to have put myself, my family, my children, my wife, my spouse through this? It's a very personal choice that you have to make. And sometimes, as I said, you don't even get to make that choice. It just happens because you're out there covering a news story.
On that note, I think we've hit the time almost on the nose. I can't thank you guys enough for taking the time to guide us through. There's a lot to think about. As you said, everybody's situation is different, and your advice on maintaining situational awareness during these difficult times is well taken. We probably could have gone another 30 or 40 or 50, whatever, but I do appreciate all of your time, your expertise, and thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having us, and hopefully you all stay safe out there, and hopefully some of what we've said is helpful.